Hello, my name is Kelly Ash. I'm the Research Associate for the Center for Rural Policy and Development. And this is a presentation providing an overview of our research looking at the impacts the downturn in the farm economy has had on the economy in greater Minnesota. I'm going to start out with a few slides talking about the Center for Rural Policy and Development, just in case you're not familiar with who we are. We were actually created by the state legislature here in Minnesota back in the late 1990s, and it's important to know that we are completely nonpartisan and unbiased. We just try to provide information regarding rural Minnesota, and we kind of talk about ourselves as a policy lab. We gather information and distill it through a rural lens and then present it in a way that gives them meaning and relevance. And it's important to know we don't make policy recommendations, but we just try to provide context and information that might help inform policy as things are being shaped and talked about and discussed, and with topics that are very relevant to rural Minnesota today. About our staff and board of directors, just so you know, there's three of us. So I'm Kelly Ash, Research Associate. Marnie Warner is our Director of Research and Vice President of Operations, and Julie Tesh is our President. I think it's interesting and important to know that we all work and live in rural Minnesota or outside of the 7-county metro area. I actually live in New London, Minnesota, in Kandiyohi County. Marnie is out of Mankato, and Julie Tesh is in her family's dairy farm down in Waldorf, Minnesota. We have 15 to 20 board members depending on the year. 13 are appointed by the governor, 2 appointed by House and Senate leadership, and then we have 5 at large to kind of make up any gaps that we might have in demographic or geographic gaps that we might have on our board. So we have real good representation. We do have a research agenda that we put together every year, but with the COVID-19 pandemic and everything else happening in the state, we kind of had to put that on the side burner. And right now we've just been publishing a post every day on our blog that kind of looks at the pandemic and the various issues that are related to it through a rural Minnesota lens. So please take a look at that if you're interested. We have a lot of different information going up there, everything from broadband and access to healthcare to what tourism and retail industries look like across the state, and where the bigger impacts might be due to all of the different orders and laws coming out over the past few weeks. So very interesting stuff. Please check that out. Okay, to the matter at hand. What are the implications of the current downturn in the ag economy for our rural communities? And we had a couple different goals when we went into this research. First was to examine the data. There is some data available to us that looks at different farm economic aspects, while also looking at the total economy for rural or greater Minnesota, whichever you would like to call it. And we also wanted to dispel some myths, because there's a lot of conversation and things being written about how the farm economy is killing rural communities. Usually that's talked about at an American level, so they kind of talk about rural America. And we wanted to see what that looked like in rural Minnesota, because rural Minnesota is actually quite more diversified economically than most like Nebraska and Iowa and some of those states. The second goal was just to pinpoint then, how does the agriculture economy affect Minnesota's overall rural economy? And what policy might be needed and would be helpful for Minnesota's farmers. And this is interesting because a lot of the really heavy policy lifting is done at the federal level when it comes to agriculture. But at the state level, what some of the solutions might look like and some of the issues that we're facing. So let's talk about, how is farming in trouble? And just to put some numbers and some idea, a little bit more framing to this. So here we have a chart that's looking at cash marketings and production expenses for all farms in Minnesota. Cash marketings is essentially the revenue made from the production of crops and livestock and other things in Minnesota farms. And this is all Minnesota farms. And you can see, where the boom was, from 2008 all the way up to 2012 and 2013. There was a nice gap between cash receipts from marketings and the expenses it took to produce those. And now over the past 4 or 5 years, that gap has slimmed, and we've seen cash receipts drop below production expenses, or just pretty much break even over the past 5-6 years. This is not a good sign. Now, to kind of see that trend and what it looks like going back to 2001, this is an index of Minnesota farm earnings, and this is an index of their net income. And so you can see, going back to 2001, you obviously start at 1, and then what that trend is compared to that year. And you can see it's kind of gone up and down, and then this huge boom where it was about 500% higher in net income for our Minnesota farmers compared to what it was in 2001, and the huge drop off in the years since. And right now they're at about 1.8, so they have essentially 80% more net income than they did in 2001, which I guarantee you, if you adjusted for inflation, means they're making less than what they made in 2001, or darn near close anyway. So that's kind of what that looks like. So how are we going to measure those impacts, and what does that look like? So we need to find a starting point. So we went out and did some literature review and talked to our folks at the University of Minnesota Extension, Department of Applied Economics, kind of see what they knew, because these guys are brilliant at this stuff. And we got connected with Dr. William Lazarus. He's a faculty member with Extension and also with the Department of Applied Economics, does a lot of stuff around farming and ag. And he put a report together and essentially looked at what are the impacts of reduced farm spending on rural Minnesota. So essentially farmers have less net income to work with. So it would be logical that they would reduce their spending. And so he identified 4 different categories in which spending would be reduced: farmland rental payments, farm building construction, farm machinery, and fertilizer purchases. He ran this through his model. They have sophisticated models at the University of Minnesota to kind of see, like, okay, if they reduce spending, you took the current data of spending and things like that farmers were doing, and then ran that through the model to try and see, like, what are the labor and essentially economic impacts that this reduced spending would kind of trickle down or ripple out into these industries that have been identified. I'm not going to go deep into this, but this is what he came up with, and it was very interesting. Essentially, the results showed that the impact isn't substantial, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation about why it isn't. And this probably is surprising to a lot of people. You would think that there would be a lot of reduced spending, but farmers don't reduce their spending that much because they have to continue to produce, and there just isn't that deep of a connection to farmers and to the local economy because of the way they purchase their products. Most of these are multinational corporations now and things like that they just don't hit the local economy as much. And so he split it up. So we got Minnesota, Northwest, West Central, and Southwest, South Central, and Southeast. And you'll look at some of these numbers and be like, oh, total impact, over $1 billion less due to the reduction of farm spending. But really, that's only a 0.5% less for the total economy in the state. Per capita change of about less than $193, and not big numbers. Obviously, when we get to Northwest and Southwest here, they increase a little bit, but we're still only talking about 1.5%, and a little bit less everywhere else. West Central 1.72% less, about $530. These aren't huge numbers considering how much agriculture makes up, of our land and discussion, particularly out in West Central and our Southwest areas of the state. But there are a couple limitations to the study. The first one is the data to conduct these analytics are only provided at large regional levels. So Dr. Lazarus can't actually go lower than the Southwest region of the state or the West Central region of the state. As soon as you start pulling data from like county level or even lower, either that one, the data doesn't exist, or two, there's a lot of error in the data. And so we can't go much lower than that. And we know at the Center for Rural Policy and Development that if you look at a region big enough, Minnesota typically, its regions, particularly its planning regions, have a pretty diversified economy across the state. So even Southwest Minnesota, which is, you'd think be largely agriculture, actually isn't made up primarily of agriculture. It's going to be health and human services, education, manufacturing, and those types of things probably have a bigger impact on wages, labor, and economic purchasing. And so we kind of knew that at a regional level, it's going to be too diversified. And so there's probably actually larger impacts, maybe at a more local level. So that's what we're going to do here. So we looked at a couple different things. One we need to talk about is this on the left is the farm economy. So this is economic activity derived directly from crop and animal production on the farm. So this has nothing to do with manufacturing, like food manufacturing or development of supplies or equipment. But then the ag-related industries economy is a whole separate thing. And that's kind of your raw materials, your services, supplies, and equipment to farmers. So that's a whole separate data set. You can't combine the two. And then we compared these things to the rural economy. So trying to look at the trends. And so what we compare is the influence. So we're going to look at farm earnings and compare that to the total earnings. And we did that by county and by EDR to kind of look at, okay, what do we see in here? Who is being most influenced by farm earnings by farm employment, which counties and regions have their total employment in all industries more heavily influenced by employment in ag-related industries, and then the wages earned in ag-related industries. So that's what we're going to do, or that's what we did, and we'll have some slides to kind of highlight what we found. So let's do that. So first, we're going to talk about farm earnings and farm employment. Now, real quick, this is a little, hit pause here if you want to read through this, but the important thing to know is that the farm earnings and farm employment is not ag-related industries. So farm earnings and farm employment are essentially the net income of the proprietors that own the farms, and then the wages and benefits earned by any partners and hired laborers that were working directly on the farm. That's who we're talking about when we talk about employment and those earnings. That's it, nothing outside of the farm. And we do that because there's two different data sets. We can't combine that with ag-related industries, unfortunately. So we're going to look at farm earnings and farm employment. Okay, two crazy graphs here, but they're real easy. This is an index. So going back again to 2001, we're looking at farm earnings compared to what it was in 2001. What are the levels in 2002, 2003, 2004, and so on. And this is split up into that entirely rural town-rural mix, urban town-rural mix, entirely urban. So every county that's considered to be entirely rural is a group. Every county that's town-rural mix is thrown together into a group, and so on and so forth. And you can see huge increases, what we kind of call the farm boom, right? From 2010 to 2014, big increases. We're entirely rural. They're up well over 600% of what they were in 2001. So when we're looking for influence, then we want to compare that to the total earnings. Which of these saw similar bumps in their total earnings? That would tell us then that regions, those types of counties have are being influenced by farms. And you can see really only our entirely rural areas up here is where you see their total earnings bump and kind of go along with the farm earnings boom and then drop back down. All the other regions, any counties that have a town-rural mix or get a little bit larger cities in them, don't have much of a bump at all. And that's kind of to be expected, again, going back to the diversified economy of these regions. But our entirely rural areas, those are the types of counties that we want to see, or we're going to see have more influence. So we look down and try to figure out by EDR, because obviously we have some entirely rural counties that are way up in northern Minnesota. They probably, particularly in the Northeast, that obviously aren't influenced by farming. So we dug down a little bit deeper. We looked at some counties and we identified a few EDRs where we're definitely seeing farm earning, their total earnings being influenced by farm earnings. And that's EDR 4 West Central, EDR 6W Upper Minnesota Valley, and EDR 8 Southwest, essentially the very western border of the state going all the way up to like around Alexandria, Otter Tail County type area. And you can see, again, index of the farm earnings, got a big boom here. And then you can kind of see that here in the total earnings where it went up with it, and now it's been kind of declining with it as well. Maybe not quite as much in West Central, but particularly in 6W and 8, the counties within these EDRs are heavily influenced by farm earnings. Now, we don't know what that means as far as impact, because obviously we looked at Dr. Lazarus' study and those ripple effects don't come out. But if we're going to find some impacts, that's probably where you're going to find it, are those counties within those EDRs. Everywhere else throughout rural Minnesota, very little influence from farm earnings, just because it's just not a big percentage of their total earnings. So these were the counties in these 3 EDRs are in particular where you're going to find the influence. Okay, we take a little bit here on farm employment. So again, this is indexed to 2001 because we're just looking, okay, where is it trending? And you can see farm employment has been on kind of a long, steady decline since 2001. A little bit, 2008, 2010, it kind of bumped up there a little bit, but now it's just, again, kind of continuing its long downward trend in farm employment. Now, there's a couple issues. This is a little bit harder to decipher on, is this, we can't really see if the actual farm economy has having any impact, because as you guys know, the farm economy was growing even in the early 2000s, not as much as it did, during the boom, but it was growing here, but yet farm employment was going down. So we're seeing a couple different things here. One, and this seems a little contradictory, and it kind of is, but let me explain it. So farming as a whole, I would say over the last 20 to 30 years has advanced to a point where we just don't need as many farmers. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about where our production of farm products is way higher than it was 20 years ago. yet the number of workers to produce that much is significantly lower, right? So we have production going up and the number of work input going into it going down, and it's largely because it's been replaced. People have been replaced with equipment, larger equipment. We're able to do more things with chemicals and things like that to make this stuff work and be productive. But the second flip point of that, and this is something we've been talking about for the past few years at the Center for Rural Policy and Development, is the lack of people to work in these positions. So it's not like all the farms are just getting rid of people and they lose their people and they don't need them. We talked to a lot of farmers and a lot of farm organizations that said there's a major need for farm workers, particularly cattle and things like that. Ranchers and livestock producers are looking for workers like crazy and they can't find them. So overall, you got this trend in agriculture where the amount of workers needed is going down, but yet this short term, we have all these folks that are retiring, baby boomer generation leaving the market, the labor pool, and kind of out migration of our younger people, just folks not getting into agriculture, means that there's also a lot of jobs available on the farm to folks. And so that's kind of playing into all of this as well. And so as far as like the farm economy goes and its influence on farm employment and farm employment's influence on total employment, it's a mess. Really the biggest trend here is that all of our rural areas really can't find workers. And so when it comes to farm employment, it's a whole separate issue. Farm earnings is still where we're seeing most of the impact. And I kind of show it here a little bit. These are these few EDRs kind of in Southwest Minnesota where you can see farm employment here has been going down for quite a while. But then you look at total employment and you saw the Great Recession hit here where employment went down on these EDRs. Some of them have recovered a little bit, but not much. And then we have some EDRs where they have less number of jobs than they did in 2001. And again, this isn't because the jobs aren't available. This is jobs filled. So if you look up the job vacancy rate of these EDRs, they're the highest in the state. So it's quite an interesting dilemma out there. Okay. So now we're going to switch over to ag-related industries. We just got done with farm employment and farm earnings. Now this is ag-related industries, and you can hit pause here if you want. These are all the ag-related NAICS categories that we threw into a pool, into a group, and then kind of looked at the trends. And we, again, went through each county. We went through each EDR to kind of see what their influences were. And like we said here, limited impacts in ag-related industries, that sure is what we saw. And so this is just one slide to represent. This is ag wages, so wages earned per employment in those ag-related industries. And you can see it's just been increasing. There really is no boom or bust that follows the farm earnings. It really seems like it is a separate market from what our crop producers and cattle and livestock producers are experiencing. This is just the way it is. You have to ignore Northeast here a little bit. It has this big spike. There's so few jobs or employment in Northeast Minnesota related to ag-related industries that they must have had like 3 or 4 jobs that were heavy paying for those 2 years, and it must have disappeared. That's just kind of a quirk in the data. So again, Northeast, just ignore that. But the general trend is we've seen ag wages per employment increase and continue to rise. And this was in almost in all the counties and all the EDRs and everything. So what does this tell us? Well, it's an interesting narrative, right? So one is Minnesota rural economy is resilient and diversified. For the most part, it can withstand a significant downturn in the farm economy. Obviously, if there's a bunch of other things, and we'll talk about that in a second, related to COVID-19, then the economy is a little bit more fragile compared to it is in metropolitan areas, but it's not reliant on farms. And that's tough to say, and farming is still crucially important. It's just that regarding economic and community development for our rural areas, it's not the #1 priority. The other thing that this data tells us, and this is the key in our opinion, is that farmers are shouldering this burden. Essentially, farmers are continuing to purchase fertilizer. They're continuing to purchase all the products they need to plant and harvest and do their thing and continue to provide food, while at the same time getting less money in return for those products and thus taking on more debt. So they're shouldering almost this entire burden, and it's not leaking out to the ag-related industries. It's not leaking out to the services being provided, to the farmers, to veterinarians and things like that. We're not seeing that as much, and so what we'll probably see then is more bankruptcies among farmers, particularly the medium to smaller ones, where if you don't have economies of scale, this is pretty hard to deal with. And that's really the summary of what we saw. Now, there's a few things happening up ahead that we need to be careful of. And so we've got red flags looking ahead. Obviously, it's a very interesting time right now, very challenging time, and it's having an impact. So the first is ethanol industry. So we have a couple different things happening on that end. It's kind of like I don't know if you'd call it a black swan event or what, but essentially we have on the left here, prices are lower than the cost of production right now. We have an oversupply of oil in the world, particularly due to the Saudi-Russian oil war. I think oil prices were like $20 a barrel, somewhere around there as of earlier this week. And on top of that, we have a dramatic decrease in fuel consumption. So we have an oversupply, and we don't have very much demand. And so that means the prices have dropped out for the production and the sales of gasoline and oil and things like that. What this has led to, and here's an article in the Free Press, is down in Mankato, Corn Plus ethanol plant Winnebago closing. And you're going to hear about a bunch of this. They're either closing or stopping operations and kind of shutting down for a while because they have tanks full of ethanol that they have no place to put it. And so they're just kind of hitting pause on all of this. Where this hits farmers is that they have a reliance on ethanol production. So 40% of Minnesota's corn goes into making ethanol. And that's a lot. And so I know people will say, well, then they'll have to switch to soybeans. Well, you talk to a farmer, they're going to tell you it's not that easy because soybeans require a certain kind of land, certain kind of soil conditions and things like that aren't translatable. Corn is just a lot easier to grow. It's a lot hardier to kind of produce. And so that's why corn is always a farmer's go-to. But that's really, this 40% is essentially gone now. Also, the second piece for our cattle ranchers, livestock producers, and things like other folks like that, a byproduct of ethanol production is a source of inexpensive food for cattle. And that stuff is called dry distillers grains, DDGs. It's what comes after they kind of soak all the corn and create ethanol from it. The leftover gets fed to cattle, and it's really, really cheap. Well, with the ethanol plants shut down right now, they're not producing that. And so all of our cattle and livestock ranchers and producers are having to look elsewhere for food sources, and those food sources are significantly more expensive. We also have worsening debt levels. This is something to keep an eye on. So this is the current ratio per farm. It's kind of the ratio that's really preferred now by the USDA and banks is kind of what they look at. And what this means is it looks at current assets. So those are assets that are easily convertible to cash. And then it looks at compares that to current obligations. So debts and obligations that need to be paid within the next 12 months. And you can see, where we were at 370% when it was booming, all the way down to 170%. That's quite a drop. And for banks who are lending right now to farmers so they can buy their seeds and equipment and things like that in the spring of every year, they usually have a threshold of, they'll tell you right around 125%. If a farmer goes below that, they won't lend to them. And again, this is the Minnesota average, is 170%. That means we probably have quite a few farmers that are below this 125% and quite a few that are still above it, but it's getting awfully dangerously close. And so what we'll probably see is more and more bankruptcies or people just not even planting in the spring, just kind of waiting it out. University of Minnesota Extension has continued to do some research. A lot of what we're talking about, they agree with as far as farming as a whole, not having large impacts on the local rural economy. But one thing they're looking at is livestock and dairy may have a deeper connection to the local economy. And so they're doing some more granular research that looks at how those connections occur. You can think of, somebody that has cattle, the veterinarian services, all the equipment needed and things like that. Those are supplied at more of a local level. And one of the worries is that livestock and dairy have been hit really, really hard. We've been seeing them leave the market at a much higher rate than crop producers. And what can happen is, let's say one of these producers leaves the market but had money that he owed to the veterinarian, for example, for a year of services. Well, that money just gets wiped off the books. And so that income that veterinarian was supposed to get is no longer going to get it. And so those are some things that we're keeping an eye on. I know Extension is keeping an eye on. If you guys want more information about that, contact us and we'll get you in touch with those guys as they kind of continue to do their research on that. The other piece is the COVID-19, the demand for food. I know there's been pictures online looking at, empty grocery store aisles, and you'd think like, oh wow, the demand for food is, through the roof. Well, that's good. The issue is that essentially there was this huge panic purchase of large quantities in preparation for a long battle with COVID-19 by our households. Now that they're stocked up, they got their freezers full of cheap beef and things like that, it's likely that they're not going to shop for that stuff as much. And now when we have restaurants and other kind of food services shut down, universities, schools, and all of that demand has been shut down. And so what that then entails is that even though we had high demand here for a bit, we're going to have significantly lower demand heading into the future at a time, which this chart shows, when we have record meat and poultry production expected in 2020. And so we're probably going to see prices drop out for these producers again. And it could get dicey over the next year unless we try to find a place where we can increase demand. The last thing I'll talk about is land values, which are staying stubbornly high. So on the left here, we have ag land value per acre. And you'll notice ag land increased as it did with net farm income per acre. You can see it's got a real nice curve and it increased about at the same rate. And then with net farm income per acre dropping off like a brick there, you can see on the left chart here that the drop hasn't been as significant. It's kind of been stubbornly high. Now, what does this mean? Well, we think it means a couple things. One is that land is a high-priced asset, and so a farmer holds this high-priced asset that may help them kind of pay off obligations and debt. And, if they decide to leave the market, they have a pretty significant asset to kind of let go of and hopefully pay back and be okay. Also, for the landowners that maybe rent out their land, they've been the ones that have been able to vary their rent prices to help farmers. So they might not be charging that much for rent to the farmer in order for the farmer to kind of get by. So essentially, some of these landowners have been kind of buffering the impacts of these low prices for farmers. Of course, the flip side here is that it's impossible for new farmers to enter the market. It's just not happening. There's no way they can do $8, $10, $12, $15,000 acre land. It's not possible. But again, on the flip side of that, if land values do drop, and let's say they drop pretty significantly, we have programs that are dependent on those property taxes, such as school districts and things like that. And so it could be really interesting if those land prices drop, what kind of impact that will ripple out then into our local communities that depend on the money made off of, the taxes made off of those values. So we just have a couple recommendations looking at this. So the first recommendation coming out of this is one, understand that agriculture does not equal greater Minnesota's economy. For the most part, greater Minnesota's economy is incredibly diverse, and we will continue to ramp on saying that the number one issue facing the rural economy, even now during COVID-19, is that they need workers. And I know that sounds crazy, unemployment skyrocketing, but that will soon stop again. People will start hiring. You talk to folks out in the rural areas, business owners, employers, and they'll say, man, we do not want to lay off our workers. We have to right now, but we really don't want to do it because they've worked so hard to get those workers and to keep those workers. And so again, we will say that will be a big deal. The other thing I'll say then connected to that is that we're probably going to see farmers go into bankruptcy, or some farmers just flat out leaving the market because they just can't deal with this anymore. And it's sad and it's hard. But we talked to a bunch of farmers in the field and some farm organizations, and they'll say one of the biggest things, one of the larger gaps they're experiencing right now is that they just don't have a good connection to the workforce development organizations in our state, including DEED. There's not a great way to assess the skill set of a farmer who have tons of skills and would be great workers in a lot of our employers out here in rural Minnesota. And so we would really urge that be something that can be looked at, maybe a specific program, or try to get DEED and some of our other workforce development organizations to really connect with farmers, try to figure out who is thinking about leaving the market and how they could get connected to a good job that pays well, that matches their skill set and provides them benefits and stability. So that would be our biggest recommendation. And of course, just so you guys know, we are doing a sign up for a monthly newsletter. Check out our YouTube channel. We're going to be doing some research videos coming out soon and some webinars explaining our newest research, just like this one. We have a new podcast out, and I did talk about the blog earlier. Please check that out in response to all the COVID-19 stuff going on. and we're on Facebook and Twitter. If you have any questions or want to talk to me personally, please just shoot me an email. I'm happy to talk. I could talk about this stuff all day, and really appreciate your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.